Well, it's interesting you bring up Guy Ritchie because he's a great example of kind of this guy, to me at least, from where I sit, who's creating these great movies with a very specific vibe nobody was doing.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, the first movie I ever waited up all night to see the first screening for was Snatch. When that came out, I was in film school in Vancouver. I waited outside the movie theater for the first showing that morning. And people thought I was crazy because there was no lines for it. But I'm like, this movie looks like one of the most original things I've ever seen in my life. I have to see this first. And then after he started getting these directing gigs, it seems like that's what happened to the film industry. So I'm paralleling it with the 70s because the 70s were these auteurs, these American auteurs that were creating movies on relatively low budgets. They were very unique. They were very personal. They were very much showing what America felt like at that time. From these gritty cop movies like The French Connection,
Yeah, yeah.
or and the same guy ended up doing The Exorcist, right?
Hmm.
There's a vibe to those movies. And then once we transition into the 80s and things get cleaner and polished, and then by the end of the 80s, it's super colorful. And then in the early 90s, it's not only colorful, but all the movie scores are super happy
Yeah.
and oh, you know, and it's just, that's to me, like there's a parallel between that and what happens when you get all these directing offers. You just transition away from sort of
We
that
do.
like there's nothing Guy Ritchie's doing now that I feel like has that same auteur feel. Like
Have
they
you
feel
seen
like
the
movies, like generic
Gentleman?
movies.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I think Jan might have seen that
Because
because
I
she
felt like,
clicks these
yeah.
things more. Yeah,
Because Snatch, I felt like, because I agree. I mean, yeah, Snatch. Then he sort of did Sherlock Holmes films, which felt a bit
right,
more,
right.
yeah. And then, but then the thing is, so I kind of had lost a bit of interest. And then I saw The Gentleman, and for me personally, it really clicked and had everything Snatch had. And I actually
Oh
kind of
yeah.
prefer it, which is saying something because I really
Right.
enjoyed Snatch.
Well,
But I was like,
I'll
wow,
definitely check it out because
I think,
once
yeah,
somebody looks like that, they're conforming, they fall off my radar. But since you're recommending it, I'll check it out.
it is completely different than anything else that came out that year. I'll say that, and it's very bold again. Like it's like his early stuff where it's completely unique, and it's also
Yeah.
it is incredibly well represents kind of like British culture, which is something you don't really like. I say in British films, they always seem to be kind of geared at an American audience as well. And I feel like, I mean, it's the same. I saw a really interesting thing about with Tarantino actually on I think it was on a podcast and like Joe Rogan or something, talking about how he felt that the 80s kind of became this time where films were all about self improvement of like working on yourself, and it's like all the films are about a guy who starts off bad becomes good in a way, and
Right.
then apparently he said that he thinks nowadays it's about a character, a character. There's almost this energy of culturally of like, there's something bad with like there's something bad, but it's all society's fault. And instead of it being self improvement, it's all about trying to improve society. But in some cases, not in the best productive ways. But
I would agree with that. You said you heard that on Joe?
yeah, Joe Rogan, he did
Yeah.
really good
I
with
actually don't agree
Tarantino.
with him on a lot of things, but I 100% agree with that because it's sort of the film industry in general has sort of reflected the vibe and ideals of
Yeah,
society
yeah,
in whatever specific era. So if you look at films from the 50s, they look like ads from the 50s. Like it's
yeah, yeah,
polished and there's always the wife at home working in the kitchen. And then
yeah,
in the 60s that started to change, the 70s, blah, blah. So that makes perfect sense. That's why like every fucking 80s movie has a scene in a sports club or a gym or something. Self-improvement,
yeah. It's all
you
like
know?
getting better. And then I feel like, and I think they said the kind of to the effect, and again, this is kind of loosely quoting, but it was to the effect of like now it's kind of it represents this, throw all your problems on society because it's society's fault, and don't have any self improvement because you're perfect with all your flaws. And in some cases, good advice. In other cases, it can be counterproductive, perhaps. But it's interesting how art can reflect the time it's made in. That's what I've always found. So one of the incredible things is you kind of whether it be painting, a song, or anything, it kind of naturally takes on parts of the world at that time. But no, it's I really know what you mean about everything becoming more polished, kind of moving into the 80s. I feel like in a way, I feel like film lost its personality in a way. It became more almost like a group of like a board of directors' ideas as opposed to an individual artist. I think maybe the 90s. I think it's funny because music was the same, so I think maybe it's informed by a culture. But I think in the 80s, you kind of I feel like in music in the 60s and 70s was like film. You kind of had it really kind of risky and raw and like really diving into stuff. And then in the 80s, it kind of gets a bit clean and polished. And then in the 90s, you have grunge, and at the same time, you have Tarantino coming out of Reservoir Dogs and all this. And it kind of, and obviously the early 2000s, there were some great films, like No Country for Old Men, There'll Be Blood.
Well, it's interesting too, because you got me thinking about the 80s is basically the Reagan era. And when Reagan got elected, there was a bit of a Baptist revival happening in the United States, where it really heavily informed parental decisions, what the parents made acceptable for their kids to digest. If they wanted them to keep going to the theaters, gritty cop movies, horror movies where little girls are telling you that your mother sucks cocks in hell, those aren't going to fly in a Reagan Baptist revival era. What's going to fly are silly movies where the ideals that are more likely to be adopted by people like that will be accepted. And then, oh, sure, you want to take your girl to go see a movie? Sure, you can go, because all the movies out there are now safe. They weren't safe in the 70s, but they're safe now.